It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to build on this ongoing relationship. I'm conscious that I'm competing with the Iowa caucuses, so you're probably checking your Twitter feeds and figuring out who won this peculiar exercise in American democracy. But obviously I'm here completely as a private citizen, as a kind of an analyst who thinks about or tries to keep abreast of the region. I know there are many experts in the room, but let me offer you some views. When I had planned this trip, of course, the official announcement from the White House had not been made about the trip, about the summit. But when Dr. Tong suggested that maybe I come and share some thoughts, I thought it would be a good opportunity not only to share some of my thoughts, but really to hear some of the questions and concerns that are percolating in this region, and you already brought some of those to the fore. So let me take about 30, 35 minutes and lay out a case, kind of in two halves. The first is why the summit, what's going to happen there, what are the issues, maybe some of the outcomes that are possible. Of course, we don't know. We don't know till the president and the leaders of the 10 countries sign things and issue things, but at least we have some idea. Our officials have just been through the region. Secretary Kerry had just been to Cambodia, as you well know, and to Laos. Danny Russell, Assistant Secretary of State Danny Russell, was here, gave a very important address at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I guess it was about last week. So our officials have been percolating through the region, giving us some teasers on what we can expect. And then finally, I thought I'd step back a little bit and give you an assessment of the broader issue, which will lead into the kind of Q&A period about, where does Southeast Asia fit structurally? I mean, given what we set out to do in the rebalance, kind of where are we? What's the kind of way to think about it? That's one person's view. I look forward to engaging. Okay, so why? The dates are set, February 15th, 16th. This is Rancho Mirage, California. For those of us Americans, I know Bill Tao is from California. I'm from a little north up in Seattle, but we feel great that we're engaging Asia in such a public way on the West Coast. I always remind friends in Asia that the United States didn't have a West Coast till 1850 when California became a state. So that we always remind myself that there's been a long pivot to the region, 150-year pivot to the region where we've become more and more engaged. But so this is kind of symbolically interesting. The Obama administration, in its statement about why the summit said three things. They said this is going to build on the deeper partnerships with ASEAN. They said it's going to further advance the administration's rebalance to the region, and it's going to strengthen the strategic partnership, which, as you know, was launched in Kuala Lumpur at the November 2015 summit, where we laid out this concept of a strategic partnership, and you know subsequently that the action plan was also released. It's a 14-page action plan which lays out step-by-step sort of issues that are going to be taken up. Let me add a little color of my own to what the White House has said, in the sense that some areas I think are particularly significant. One is that this is unprecedented. This is not a necessary summit. This is not this is an out-of-cycle summit. There's no requirement to hold one before the next one on the sidelines of, say, the EAS in Laos. So just by definition, for the President of the United States to issue such an invitation in November is quite a significant deal. The second sort of color to this summit is that it's personal. This is a personal presidential decision. It's a White House decision. And he's committed 2 days, more than 2 days, to travel from Washington to California to hold this summit. So it really does speak to a very, I think, a very serious commitment to this event. U.S. officials have spoken publicly on the record about that this is in some sense also a courtesy visit. It's, if you look at the statistics, and believe me, we've looked at them, no American president has ever visited more Southeast Asian countries on more occasions than this president. And that's, it's a little data point, but it's not an insignificant one. by the time he leaves office. Of course, I wouldn't claim to speak for the president's schedule, but we can assume that he'll get pretty darn close to going to every one of the 10 Southeast Asian countries. And not only that, if you break down the visits, both for specific ASEAN or Southeast Asia related things as well as other meetings, you'll see that he's visited multiple places in Southeast Asia more than once. And I think this is also a testament to his personal and presidential commitment. I think the fourth element is that the president really very much seeks to highlight what I guess the administration would regard as successes. I've already mentioned the visits to 7 of the 10 ASEAN capitals and the most visits by any US president, but I would also note that this is the first time we've had ambassadorial representation in every capital in Southeast Asia since 1997. This is also not insignificant or trivial. It's a matter of a very deliberate policy and engagement. The most dramatic, of course, which is the opening, as you well know, of appointing a full ambassador to Myanmar. I think the signing of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 2009 was a first step and opened up, of course, the participation first in 2010 of Secretary Clinton as observer and then the president himself attending the East Asia Summit, which, as you know, for those of you who read our debates, this was not a done deal. This was a matter of, considerable toing and froing within the U.S. system and deciding whether this was the right way to go and whether this was a commitment we wanted to make and therefore a commitment that we could keep. So I regard this as an important element of our policy. Obviously, you all know that the U.S. was the first to appoint a resident ambassador to ASEAN, first by appointing an ambassador in 2008 and then establishing a resident ambassador in 2010. And also the president's commitment to have annual leaders meetings. And then I think they became, at some point, though I don't remember when, became meetings to summits. And then, of course, culminating in this 2015 strategic partnership. Now, from the region's perspective, I've heard, and I will tell you very critically, someone once said to me, it's not like you're doing us a favor. But to institutionalize such commitments on an ongoing on an ongoing systemic basis in the U.S. is, I think, an important sign of the kind of commitment we're trying to make to this region, and an indication of just how high the priority is. I don't think it was necessarily, it wasn't necessary to do these summits. We could have done the business without these summits, but the fact that they were committed to and regularized and steadily moved in terms of the work plan is an indication of this interest. So what's likely to be discussed? Well, if you read the strategic partnership announcement in November, it's very clear there are 4 or 5 areas: economic integration, maritime cooperation, transnational challenges, emerging leaders, and opportunities for women in ASEAN. So in some sense, much of this, as I said, already exists. There's no brand new issues. Some new issues might come to the table as in the 2 weeks. I would venture to guess, I don't know this, but I would venture to guess things like concern about the spread of Zika, of the Zika virus might come up, but there would be precedent for this, for discussions of pandemics before in our joint statement, so this would not be earth-shattering. I think the first thing is, of course, this ASEAN economic community, and including support for how to move this forward and how the U.S. can be helpful. Secretary Kerry spoke in Cambodia specifically about moving forward with TIFAs and bilateral investment treaties where they don't exist, and how we can improve upon those in order to further support the integration agenda. I would be surprised if TPP were not discussed. I think people are aware of all kinds of views about TPP, including in my own country. I'm sure you've read lots of statements. There's a wide variety of views. But I would be pretty surprised that if TPP didn't come up somewhere in the context of these discussions of economic integration, not least because 4 countries are, of course, signatories. February 4th in New Zealand, they'll sign the TPP. Mr. Froman is going to be there, and 3 other countries in Southeast Asia have now expressed an interest, at least, in joining TPP. President Jokowi, when he was in Washington, admitted quite frankly in a public address at which I was present that he seemed to have caught the president by surprise in declaring his support for TPP. And we've also had indications both from the Philippines and from Thailand of interest in TPP. So if you put those together, of the 4 actual signatories on February 4th, day after tomorrow, as well as 3 who've indicated an interest, whatever timeline that is, that we now have 7 of the 10 countries in some way looking for a way to participate. My hunch is that since so much is unclear about the next steps on the TPP ratification process in all of the countries, including the United States, that there won't be anything definitive or declarative about this, rather than to recognize that this is an element of the integration effort. And then I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion on more detailed things. Assistant Secretary Russell, again, in his speech, talked a lot about innovation and entrepreneurship and how that will be an issue. There will inevitably be discussions about the investment climate and social rules and environmental rules and labor rules and those kinds of things that go into such discussions. And the fact, we don't know this, of course, but the fact that the meeting is in California, not far from access to some of the highest technology and innovation and entrepreneurial firms and people, I wouldn't be shocked if there were some private sector component of the meeting at some point. As you know, President Jokowi was scheduled, for example, to go to Silicon Valley and had to cancel because of the Hayes issue. You'll recall that Prime Minister Modi went to Silicon Valley, and you'll recall that President Xi summoned a meeting of technological leadership of private companies as well. So this is part of a pattern of several Asian countries and Asian leaders when they come to the US and have an opportunity to engage these leaders. The second issue is maritime. I mean, I'm not going to belabor this issue. I don't think we're going to hear something wildly new. We've already heard a lot of speeches in this last 7-8 days, as well as some developments such as the FONOPS and the Paracels. Secretary Kerry in Laos spoke specifically about a unified ASEAN protection of maritime rights and the avoidance of militarization and conflict. And I think these general themes that if you look back and decipher what's been said in every previous US-ASEAN statement, I would imagine that you're going to see some elements of those being repeated. I'm sure other countries who are present would weigh in on their own views of things, such as the tribunal case, for example. I would be shocked if it didn't come up from another country who's party to the tribunal case. And of course, I expect, though probably not at a leaders level discussion, some discussion of US ongoing maritime capacity building efforts. As you know, in the US defense budget, there's been $140 million allocated for maritime capacity building efforts. On the human rights, governance, democracy issues, I don't think there'll be sort of a leaders level dialogue on these issues. But obviously in such a setting with 10 leaders and the US president, I'm sure there will be some side meetings. And so individual cases and issues may well be taken up. And again, that would be not unusual in bilateral meetings. And I would just note that California, if you look at our ASEAN Matters for America with ICES, and you go into the states and districts, if you look at the ethnic composition of California and the district of Rancho Mirage, you will see that American citizens of various Southeast Asian ethnicities are abundant in California and in the nearby area, and are likely to have their own ability to express their views and make their views known. through public representations and through newspaper advertisements and things, and so those will be also part of the background of the summit. Transnational priorities, you can bet that the ongoing cooperation in this region on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism will somewhere come into play, into discussion, not least because of the recent Jakarta attacks and the Malaysian arrests. So it's an ongoing issue of interest and concern not only to the leaders in Washington, of course, but also to leaders here and who've made their case. In Cambodia, there was quite a forthright statement from the Cambodian Prime Minister on this as well, with Secretary Kerry in their joint press appearance. So I think this will take up, I mentioned pandemics. Outcomes, let me go to outcomes. Again, it's very, tricky to speak about what the president and 10 leaders of countries will say. I would be surprised if there were a long, detailed statement. As I mentioned to you, the character of this summit is a little bit different. And I'm going to say one thing about the symbolism. I might as well just say it here. There's been a lot of kind of buzz about that this is being held at Sunnylands, that this is the same place that the president met President Xi, and that this is somehow a, what's the polite way, a message to others that the president, well, I mean, there's a matter of public record. This is Secretary Russell has kind of indicated one reason why it's at Sunnylands, because we want to have the same kind of informal, no-tie meeting with our Southeast Asian leaders as we want to be able to have with the President of China. We're at that level of comfort, we're at that level of development in our ties, and we ought to be able to have that kind of dialogue without it being just set piece. But I won't also say that there isn't an element of signaling. I think Secretary Russell had an especially strong statement about our approach to the region, and I'll just quote it to you and leave it there. This was in his Lee Kuan Yew speech. He said, "Our commitment to ASEAN centrality and to fostering rule-setting institutions demonstrates that we want to work with the region, not dominate it. We are a collaborative partner, not a hegemonic one. We want trust, not tribute, friends, not vassals." I think Secretary Russell made it fairly clear as to why those kinds of statements in the context of meeting at Sunnylands are significant. So we don't know if there'll be a long, detailed, formal statement. If you want to push this comparison of President Xi and the ASEAN leaders meeting in the same place, I would just note to you that there was not a long statement released at the end of President Xi's visit, that there was simply a statement on HFC and a press conference, and no long joint statement. So we'll wait and see exactly what that turns out to be. My hunch is there will be some small announcements related to our trade and investment ties and how we can promote them. I would especially think that there would be ways to talk about this entrepreneurship and innovation element of our trade and investment ties. I think Waisili has been a personal commitment of the president, so that would likely to be flagged somewhere along the way. And there'll probably be some small arrangements on other various environmental and maritime security and other issues. Much of what's expected is already in the plan of action to implement the US-ASEAN strategic partnership. And there's two outcomes that I just want to flag for you. One is the inevitable question, is this summit going to happen every year? I don't know. Is it going to happen under the president, next president, whoever he or she is going to be? Well, President Obama doesn't know. So I think it's important not to treat this as kind of a de facto precedent, but as I tried to indicate at the outset, that this is a personal presidential commitment by President Obama in the context of the rebalance. And of course, there's golf. And golf can certainly count as an outcome and a deliverable in any meeting. So where does that leave US-ASEAN relations today? That's sort of Sunnylands. Can we say anything about the structural state of US-Southeast Asia relations? Well, if you look at the lines of action that the President and Secretary Clinton laid out in 2011, strengthening allies, maintaining and strengthening allies, building partnerships, trade and investment, human rights and governance, all of those issues, the 6 key lines of action. You know, Southeast Asia looks to most Americans who are sort of doing this kind of Southeast Asia-US relations business as a reasonable test case of success. You saw the recent decision on EDCA in the Philippines as a way of strengthening our relationship. You know, in 2012, Secretary Panetta and Thai officials sort of gave a new framework for the US-Thai arrangement. Obviously, subsequent political developments in Thailand have created a kind of a different context, but the framework for the change in the alliance is still there, and the basic structure is there to pursue these very important alliance relationships. We've been steadily deepening our relationship with emerging partners, of course, longtime friend Singapore, but I would particularly highlight and flag Malaysia and Vietnam. And we had a really excellent visit by President Jokowi to Washington. And there's a lot of interest in moving the US-Indonesia relationship forward. The debates about multilateralism and whether to be part of them, and should we be a member, and should we participate, and how much. I mean, I don't hear that debate in Washington myself. I don't think I'm being naive. I mean, those debates about whether they're presidentially worthy and does it justify a trip, and those debates aren't there anymore. There are debates about which organizations. There are debates about how to employ those organizations. There's debates about how best to align those organizations, how to use leaders' meetings versus non-leaders' meetings. But these are tactical and mechanical processes of diplomacy, not fundamental commitments. In fact, if anything, as the quote I read to you by Secretary Russell states, we're all in on multilateralism because it's in our interest to be institutionalized presence in this region, quite apart from anything else. That the multilateral institutions, one, institutionalizes the US role here, and second, helps us foster rules and norms that we think are useful to regional development. I think the movement in TPP is part of the line of action, and we got it done. Now, there's a process. You'll remember the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement was started under a previous president. But the US has long, when people talked about what's going to change from one administration, I would remind you that both on the military realm, whether it's trying to find Osama bin Laden or continuing a process of a negotiation for a free trade agreement with an ally like Korea, may have started under one president, and it may get done under another. But there's continuity. We're not recreating the wheel each time. And whatever the fate of TPP is in the next chronological 12 months, we've negotiated a TPP. And that's a very major plank of this economic engagement to this region. Another line of action was to further adjust or tweak our military presence in this region. EDCA is just one example of this. We're doing it with others, with Australia and with Philippines, and there are others that I don't think we need to go into a lot, but the kinds of things we're doing, the kinds of exercises we're doing, the kinds of relationships we're building on the military cooperative front are also part of this adjusting the broad-based ability to engage militarily. And of course, advancing human rights and democracy. And I will tell you that this is the one issue that gets the most criticism right now of the administration's approach to Southeast Asia. I'm not necessarily agreeing with those criticisms. I'm simply flagging that that's a really important issue in the Congress. It's a really important issue in civil society. I've already mentioned that it's an important issue likely to be in a place like California, where there are a lot of people who have familial, cultural, religious, historical relationships with this region. And so they have a role. On the other hand, whatever one thinks of it, and there are debates, of course, in the US, there is a real sense that Myanmar on the whole was a net plus for our efforts to promote and support and to be part of a process of democratization. Let me end with some potential challenges and some what I think to be structural positives. I mentioned human rights. I think the general environment around ASEAN is becoming more complicated, not less. I think that the contentions around the region, and it's not just US-China, are likely to persist amongst great powers. There's likely to be more great power role here than less in the next 2-3 years. We know about the limits of ASEAN unity on various issues. That's not particularly surprising, or even for that matter, to my mind, wildly worrying. But it's something that we continue to sort of think about, and I'll explain why it relates to US policy. And there's always a sense that ASEAN has now become very internationalized. But as a process of that internationalization, it's also become quite strategically exposed. It has a lot of players now that it has to deal with. So what's the right balance between that internationalization, bringing in great powers, and that strategic exposure to the vicissitudes of the great powers themselves and their relations? Second, I think there's a fundamental issue for ASEAN is how much of an actor it can be versus how much of an arena it will become. And we can elaborate on that. I have my own theory. And the third is ASEAN has talked about centrality, and that's fine. US accepts that centrality as a matter of official policy. But ASEAN also says that it's a platform for others to engage. So how do these roles work in multilateral institutions, and how do they work outside of multilateral institutions? These are questions. I don't have any answers. I just mentioned these as some of the challenges that we try to think through in terms of how it affects our policy. I think there are 4 or 5 real important structural benefits or positives currently in US-ASEAN relations. First, general political, that is to say elected members of our democracy, members of Congress, governors, political officials, as well as policy people, now appreciate ASEAN and appreciate Southeast Asia. It's an educational process, right? ASEAN Matters for America is in part an educational tool. Not everyone is sitting at think tanks like ICES or East-West Center writing on US-Southeast Asia policy. We have to make the case. Why are we there? Why is the president meeting with these 10 leaders? Why are we cutting deals? Why are we approaching it this way? I mean, this has to do with, especially in an election year, why does this matter for America? What's our interest here? What's our trade? What's our investment? What's the students? What's the money? What's the number of direct flights, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we're getting that knowledge base built. We're getting that knowledge base built. And a presidential meeting like this is a really good way, when it's held in the US, to get that across. It's one thing to hold it on the sidelines in Kuala Lumpur, not taking anything away from that. I'm simply saying it's a really big way to get press coverage and some attention. And I think South China Sea and the ASEAN community and all these things are helping build that kind of understanding or appreciation for 600 million people, young people, growing middle classes, economic growth, future, impact on climate change, democratization. All of those issues are being felt. And some of the old jokes about ASEAN as a misspelling or mispronunciation of Asian are still there. I just note that I'll be going to a conference in San Francisco the day after the Sunnylands Summit. And the conference is called Asia's Best Kept Secret, which I was thinking about was, still a way in which it tries to pull people in, right? What is that secret? Well, it's ASEAN. And this is why we're going to spend 2 days talking with business leaders and others about it. The second positive is that the U.S. has a variety of tools to deal with the countries of this region, bilateral, regional, ASEAN, and of course our global interests. The United States is a global power. We have global interests, countering violent extremism, pandemics, international systems, the UN, global rules, world trade. So it can never be exactly right, the calibration of this bilateral, regional, ASEAN institutional and global, but I think we're roughly right. We're pretty well calibrated in these approaches. And so I think that's good. I think a third very good structural change is that we're beginning to get a little bit balanced in the balance between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. I mean, if you think about it, from 1975 to mid-1990s, we had very limited relations with mainland Southeast Asia. And the opening to Myanmar and the opening to Vietnam, think about it. Malaysia and Vietnam are now TPP members. Thailand has, and I'm using the number loosely, so don't quote me on the number, but give or take 80% of our foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia, in mainland Southeast Asia. Well, with the opening of Myanmar and the accession to TPP of Malaysia and Vietnam, we are going to see some shifts. It's quite natural, matter of private sector, but also of the trade agreements. This puts Southeast Asia on a kind of a balance between the 10 countries, and I think that's generally good for U.S. interests. It's certainly, I think, good for the region. I think the U.S. Bilateral relationships have improved significantly with just about every country. It's easy to get lost in the details, but the fact that the president is going to Laos, that he's been to Cambodia, that he's been to Myanmar, this is quite unimaginable 8-9 years ago. There was a question whether we could meet with ASEAN leaders. There was a question with what level we could have an ASEAN dialogue in the situation of Myanmar being pre-election. This is a pretty staggering change if you think about it. So there's no question about it. Are there issues of debate about, is this gone far enough? Do we need to work? Should we keep sanctions on the back burner? I mean, but these are technical and management questions. These are not questions of re-engaging with Myanmar.